Hello, as my esteemed colleague is always saying, and welcome to this very special edition of the Archaeo-Soup Meet the Archaeologist strand. This is really designed as a special, for those of you that are celebrating Easter, it's an Easter egg. For anybody else, it's a sort of birthday present to mark the 14th anniversary of Archaeo-Soup, which you might have seen being celebrated at various points on social media recently. Archaeo-Soup, almost from the get-go, runs a strand called Meet the Archaeologist. And it's now, I think it's over 30 separate interviews, including some which are really important archive interviews, like, for example, the late Professor Rosemary Cramp from Durham University.
Mm-hmm. And also Tony Wilkinson as well.
Indeed, and we'll come to that as we speak. As you can see, I'm joined on his own channel by the proprietor, because in all those Meet the Archaeologist interviews, no one's ever thought to ask to meet Marc Barkman-Astles, who is Mr. Soup, Mr. Archaeo-Soup, the brains, the editor, the camera person, the creative, whatever you want to name it, behind this channel, which must be one of the longest running video channels on the net, I would imagine by now.
Not quite, but it's certainly, yeah, it's had a life so far, yeah.
And we'll come to we'll deal with that life in possibly excruciating detail as we talk. Now, the way this works, any of you that have watched Meet the Archaeologist before, you'll know that there are two set questions at the end, and I'll come to those at the end of this interview. But other than that, it's freeform, it's unscripted. We can go where the conversation takes us, and so basically, kick back. I hope you've poured a drink. If not, go and get one now, and enjoy, because this doesn't happen very often. He's normally behind the camera, or if he's in front of the camera, at least he's in far more control than he is this afternoon.
Yeah.
So, and I have also promised that I won't do a Jeremy Paxman on Newsnight and do a Michael Howard on him and ask him the same question 13 times if I'm not satisfied with the answer. But aside from that, off we go. Okay. And really, for the old Soupians out there, as a reminder, for the new Soupians who may be watching this for the first time and just discovering Archaeo-Soup and the range of things that Archaeo-Soup does, who is Marc Barkman-Astles?
Is that a question?
It was a question. Who is? There is normally an interrogative behind that. Yes.
No, I wasn't sure if you were going to go like, "This is your life," and here they can just go through. I've
got a red notepad. I've got a red folder.
That might do. That might do. But I self-identify as an archaeologist in that sense. It depends on who you ask what exactly it means to be an archaeologist. But I herald from North Wales, a town called Prestatyn, went to study archaeology at university, having done a summer experience excavation at a place called Poulton Abbey, just across the English-Welsh border in Cheshire. Had a grand time and realised that I quite enjoyed studying the past, specifically through physical remains. So went off to uni, studied at Durham University, worked far too hard, and I'm not. I don't mean that tongue in cheek. Genuinely, I didn't have to work as hard as I did. And after graduating with a half decent degree, went to York to work at the Jorvik Viking Centre, and it was really there that I discovered something akin to a student experience, because in York you can live fairly well in a single room flat, surrounded by pubs, and dressing up every day as a Viking. It's not too bad. Eventually moved back up to the northeast of England to marry the wonderful Mrs. Soup, and it wasn't long after that I started a YouTube channel called Archaeo-Soup. And while I was looking for work, because I graduated into the credit crunch, and then since then things have only, I don't know, plateaued and or got worse. While I was looking for a job in that sort of in those sorts of conditions, I figured I might as well try and turn what was becoming a fairly watched YouTube channel into something of an educational business. And so, bit by bit, Archaeo Soup happened, really.
Let me step back, because you've just taken up probably the first half dozen questions I was going to ask you.
Oh, okay.
No, it's quite all right. I just want to explore. I want to explore a little bit more.
You asked who are you? Who are you?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I thought you might stop with sort of Prestatyn and the Welsh border, but
Oh,
anyway,
okay, right. Sorry.
No. No. But the whole point about this is, as I said, it's freeform and it's fun. But can I just sort of step back to that first experience? Can you remember what made you want to do it in the first place? Because it's not something. Okay, a lot of people who now work in archaeology might be able to recollect an experience like that, but it's not one that's particularly common, even in our generations of archaeologists.
It was twofold, I think. The first thing is that I still love, but I certainly very much loved castles. I visited lots of castles in North Wales. It's one of the most castled landscapes in the world, I believe. And spent a lot of time drawing them as well. For a long time, I was most certainly going down the route of being an artist and or an architect or something. That's what my family told me anyway. And I realized towards the end of high school that I couldn't keep on doing that. I couldn't keep on offering up artwork for other people to mark and to basically you're putting yourself onto the page and someone gives it a grade, and I wasn't too. It was a bit tiring, a bit exhausting. And while I loved history and, in that sense, trivia and antiquities and antiques, every Christmas my family would often buy me something weird and wonderful from a strange shop in Prestatyn that did house clearances. So pipe cleaners and compasses and this kind of thing. I hadn't really thought about archaeology until my then girlfriend was going to do a test dig, and I think she just had invited me along. I thought, okay, I'll give it a go, and it sort of went from there, really. Incidentally, Poulton Abbey is a site that featured in an episode of Time Team sometime after we were there, or I was there, and it was an interesting place on the edge of the Queen's cousin's land. I seem to recall there was some sort of risk of being shot if you crossed a corner as opposed to going around a field, and it was the place where I excavated my first skeleton, my first human burial, which I do have some photos of on the wall there. And they're not very good photos. I took sort of 3 angles. I had to sort of do a photo mosaic to make it work. But it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about that intersection between being alive and not so much communing with, but certainly meeting the dead, and having respect for those who've gone before us in that sense, and how we interpret their lives.
And now, obviously, the transfer from that to university. When you said to your school, presumably your sixth form tutors, that you were going to apply, not just to apply for university, which obviously a lot of people in sixth form are encouraged to do, but the fact that you were going to apply to do archaeology at Durham. What kind of reaction did that get? Did they understand, or did they say, yeah, but have you thought about doing accountancy?
They didn't say accountancy. To be fair, the careers advisor in my high school then, and I'm sure it's different now, was essentially saying to everyone, "Have you considered being a farmer?" Because that's what a lot of people in the area did, and I think their imagination wasn't particularly big in that sense in terms of prospects. The teachers who I respected and who were good teachers, I think, good and passionate people, for the most part, thought that I should certainly go on to higher education, and And I was in the bunch of people who were sort of being told, you should apply for Oxbridge. You should go for Oxbridge. Go on, apply. But I didn't, at that point, I didn't really know what that meant. I had no idea really what that there were different types of universities and different scales and different ways of measuring which one you go to, different courses and so on and so forth. I just didn't know any of that. Also, as well, I had a very I was extremely self-conscious and very shy and very I lacked self-confidence in that sense as well. So even if I had actually been forced into, say, a Cambridge interview or something, I'm not sure I would have performed particularly well. So somehow, and I think it must have been going through the Times University supplement, somehow I landed on applying to Durham. It seemed like a good course. And the one thing I do remember from the Times supplement that year, so it would have been 2002, 2003, because I actually went to university in 2004, was that they said, for everything else, it sort of said, accountant. If you take this course, you can expect earnings of so-and-so, blah, blah. You can expect to live in this city and that place, and you can expect to, be happy. But then for the for the archaeology one, it just said, archaeology is more of a passion than a career, really. And they struggled really to fill out the paragraph. It was, but that didn't put me off. I was genuinely intrigued, and off I went for not so much an interview. I was accepted onto the course without an interview, which apparently wasn't a given. But I went up to see what the city was like, and I quite liked it.
We'll maybe come back to that idea that archaeology is something you do as a passion project and not to earn a living later. But before I leave the sort of the North Wales background or the Borderlands background, the liminal background you have, and you've mentioned castles. Obviously, in modern archaeological study, that is often seen as a colonial landscape. Many of those castles, particularly the Iron Ring, Edward I's Iron Ring, were planted onto the basically invaded, conquered Principality of Llywelyn ap Griffith, last Prince of Wales, and it's now seen as a much more complicated story than maybe it was 40, 50 years ago. And obviously also on the being on the Welsh border, not just in sporting terms, in terms of rugby. It's a place where people choose their identities. So, and I know you identify very proudly as Welsh. How is that? And how do you feel when you leave Wales, when you left Wales to go to somewhere like Durham, which is seen as almost, you mentioned again Cambridge, Oxford and Cambridge, as sort of Oxbridge light for people that didn't manage to get into Oxbridge or Oxford or Cambridge?
That's not entirely fair, but okay, I'll let you say it.
You're right.
Yeah, no, Durham has actually a higher private school intake than Oxford or Cambridge, I seem to recall, especially at undergrad level. So it is a place where a certain type of person ends up. And again, I wasn't ready for it, but at the same time, I think that's probably a good thing. I remember, leaving Wales, going up we drove up in the car, broke down actually on the way there. So I actually arrived with our car on the back of a tow truck that was going to drive all the way back down to Wales that night. And the first thing that happened when I got there was, obviously, mum and brother went away, and this guy comes in who had been assigned as my, I don't know, college father or something, someone to take care of me for the first couple of weeks, and all I remember, his name was Hamish. His surname escapes me, probably Macintosh or something. And he goes, hello, my name's Hamish. Nice to meet a fellow Celt. We're going to have a lovely meal down on the Bailey later on this evening. just settle yourself in, and off we go. And didn't even have time to unpack, and suddenly you're surrounded by all these people who you don't know if they're going to become firm friends or not, or if you're gonna, if you're gonna remember their names, in a matter of days. So you're sort of making very tentative conversation all the way down into town. Because incidentally, as well, this was the first and I think only year that particular my particular subset of the university, something called St Cuthbert Society, had housed people outside the city. So we were a good sort of 2 or 3 miles away. Had to walk all the way down, all the way along. A couple of the older guys were singing, college songs, this kind of thing, and it all just felt a bit. I mean, you might say today it felt a bit Hogwarts, I guess, but I didn't necessarily identify with that. I didn't necessarily understand it, and in that sense, I am very pleased to have been able to hold on to something of a alternative view of the establishment, growing up in Wales and then coming into England and going to a fairly posh university, that I think possibly might not have happened if circumstances had been slightly different. If I'd gone to a private school, I might not have been aware of this stuff in the same way that I am to this day. And it's also interesting because even today I'm still living on a border. I mean, technically I wasn't really on the border in Wales. I was, I was a good 30, 40 miles, I think, in from the border on the coast. But I was certainly at the end of Offa's Dyke. Prestatyn is at one end of Offa's Dyke. And so maybe I'm just destined to be in liminal areas, and in that sense have a slightly alien eye looking at both camps on either side of these borders, these sorts of areas, and just go, what's going on? How do people behave? And I think that's probably what drew me to archaeology. Really was trying to understand people's behaviour in a way that wasn't just pure psychology.
Now, looking at Durham, particularly Durham at that period, and still is to a large extent, it was one of the premier archaeology courses in the UK, and the teaching staff are a who's who of academic archaeologists, really.
It often ranks number one, people at home. Often.
And there are academic staff there slaving away over their metrics, and often people who are leaders in their field. Do you recall any particular? I mentioned Professor Rosemary Cramp earlier, who you interviewed subsequently for Archaeo-Soup, but what do you remember of the teaching there? And were there any particularly inspirational, influential teachers that you worked under?
Yeah, I mean, for me, probably the most influential was a guy called Peter Rowley Conway, who I later learned is an archaeologist of Welsh and Danish descent, who actually is from just up the road from where I'm from. We would often drive past his family pile on the way to Sainsbury's. But I'm glad I didn't know that initially. Had I realised that, I might not have approached him or got to know him particularly well. But he was interesting, as some of my favourite archaeologists are interesting, in so much as there's a certain sort of pragmatic questioning of the whole premise that you can look at remains that exist today and understand how people lived in the past. Peter is a pigs in the Mesolithic Neolithic transition specialist in particular, but also he loves the Mesolithic more generally, especially around what became the North Sea in Scandinavia, in the northern continent, and also on the British coast. And what I liked about him was the fact that he would just say things like, so you're going to hear that it's entirely possible to maybe go through a landscape and understand what Joe Bloggs was thinking on the 14th of December, 6000 BC. I think this is total bollocks. And but what was great was that that sort of pragmatism was an invitation to understand why he thought that, and also why he might be wrong. And what was interesting was that actually, when he said, I think this is total bollocks, he was actually basically creating an informal landscape of discourse where people could say, but actually, have you read Ian Hodder on this? Have you read Shanks and Tilly? Have you read so and so, and so and so? And out of that would come conversation. So he was Kenny. Charlotte Roberts, the pathologist, paleopathologist, excellent in terms of discussion of human remains, disease, and she was great and is great for a young archaeologist learning to work with the dead and understanding the need to study human remains, which can be a fraught ethical question for someone not prepared for that, but also as well having respect for those remains and crucially not straying into parody or caricature when handling particularly grave settings where someone has been laid to rest in a particular way. For example, I sometimes see young student age archaeologists getting this balance wrong. So, for example, I've received photographs at ArchaeoSoup for sharing on social media. Like, isn't this hilarious? Of a skeleton with sunglasses and a cigarette placed between the maxilla and the jaw, or in their teeth rather. And I have to sort of carefully just respond saying, this really isn't appropriate. This is not what you should be doing. And that awareness of not becoming desensitized to the dead actually was something which also was mentioned when I did my first ever excavation, trying to avoid the leg bones connected to the hip bone, and it becoming almost like a geometric exercise of finding a shape as opposed to unearthing human remains. So that is something that I was very grateful for I am very grateful for looking back. There's people like John Chapman, who is a wonderful, slightly spacey mind. He has a head full of essentially it's a reference library for archaeology and fragmentation of artifacts and what artifacts mean in terms of relationships and object biographies and all this sort of thing. He actually oversaw my dissertation. And just two more people I'll mention in terms of people who have influenced me, I suppose, my mentors, I guess you could say, in terms of how I think about archaeology. Chris Capel, tremendously. He is a conservator. I suppose you could probably more accurately a materials scientist who works in the realm of conservation, and he himself is fascinated by the sort of philosophy of what that means to go on an excavation to recover something, to preserve it in a chosen state. Because at what point do you stop, for example, taking rust bloom off a sword? At what point is it okay to, is it stable and doesn't have to look pretty, this kind of thing. But also as well, he instilled in me a sense of in a similar way to Peter Rowley Conway, of the absurdity of some people's egos in the realm of archaeology. Definitely. And I'm very grateful to him for that. And then there's Eva Fernandez Dominguez, who was a recent addition to the department before I graduated. Or she may even have come just after I graduated. I've been back and forth quite a lot over the years. But her approach to ADNA, ancient DNA, and what it does and doesn't mean, what it can and cannot do, and also as well, again, the ethics, the morals, and the laboratory work, the practicalities of working with that stuff, I found inspiring. And again, it influences. I suppose what I'm describing here, for the most part, isn't so much about who taught me digging, but who taught me, or who helped me to explore boundaries, particularly of best practice, and and a philosophy of being a good person doing archaeology, as opposed to just being a good archaeologist. And I'm very grateful for that. And what I should say as well, you say what I think is increasingly an outdated joke about Durham being a place where Oxbridge rejects go. But I genuinely believe that, because I stayed in touch with my then girlfriend for the first year at Durham, And I've since met many friends and colleagues who've been to Oxford and Cambridge and other departments, St Andrews and others. And the Durham department does have something special. It has a way of thinking that's a little bit looser, and they encourage, from my experience, and again comparing and contrasting, you don't get the same piece of paper, as it were. Certainly in the Cambridge department, it used to be the case that essentially you were getting a Cambridge archaeology degree and you will study these things, and you'll come out and people will know this is what you know. But actually at Durham, you're free to do that, but also to have a curiosity-led experience if you are up for it, and if you put in, you get out of it what you put in. And I say that I worked too hard, but maybe I was just compelled to do so because I was given the freedom to do so, perhaps.
Now, another thing I know about you both from your work with Archaeo-Soup, but also from talking to sort of mutual friends and acquaintances.
Mm-hmm.
Back to your school days, you were also a creative. At one stage, you were in a band.
Yeah.
You've and now with Archaeo-Soup, you don't just do the straight sort of video as an excerpt from an academic monograph. You're actually learning the visual language, the filmic language, the musical languages even. And I know people who are watching this might be familiar with that smash hit, "We Don't Do Dinosaurs."
We don't do dinosaurs, no we don't do dinosaurs. Ranger trials as one will call, no we don't do dinosaurs.
Yeah.
So that is at odds with some people's view of archaeology. Some people see archaeology as a STEM subject and it's rigorously scientific, and there's much less room for that kind of expression. And I'm not saying science isn't creative, because obviously thought processes are creative, but the idea of celebrating that creativity using other forms, music, drama, film, whatever, are less current. I won't say less accepted, but certainly less current in the sort of discourse within the discipline. How did you maintain that the both strands, if you like, in your work?
I remember early on in the Meet the Archaeologist series, and incidentally, it is a series that I do plan on getting back to. I'm always planning on getting back to it, but I do plan on getting back to it this year, and adding more people to that series. But early on, I remember in interviews with some staff at, for example, Newcastle University, where off camera they would sort of say, "So how are you gonna? How does this work? How do you make money? How do you?" And what I couldn't explain at that point was adequately was how. I couldn't explain how. I couldn't necessarily fully explain what the plan was, and in that sense, I'm not sure that I even still have a plan yet, and maybe I should start to form one in the near future. But it was a matter of for me, having benefited from going to university and learning all this cool stuff that as we've talked about in Watching Brief, this idea of the curse of knowledge. Suddenly, something, exactly what the Viking period in England was, and when it was, and that it was after the Romans, not before the Romans. And this sort of stuff is not common knowledge. It's not stuff that everyone knows. Quite often people will say, "So is that before or after the Romans?" That kind of thing. And I didn't want to be, as I saw some colleagues being, someone who sat around in a pub sort of going, "Can you believe most people don't know this?" Or most people think that Neanderthals are our direct ancestors. And given that people were saying that, and then later on, a few years later, it was shown that actually Neanderthals did contribute to Northern European DNA. Again, it just shows the danger that you run the risk of getting yourself into when you take a position of, "I've learned something, other people don't know this thing, therefore I am special," or "I know," or "therefore my perspective matters." Whereas actually, I really wanted more people just to know some of this stuff, and I think that's where the balance has been, and it's not been easy. For every, when so often people will say across the world. So in the past, with this 14th anniversary thing for Archaeo, I've had people messaging saying, from France, from Indonesia, from the US, from South America, from Scandinavia, from places in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Ireland itself. People getting in touch and saying, "Oh, your videos are used in our high school, in our college, in our university. They got me through this course. They helped me with this essay. They blah, etc. etc." And that was always the goal, was to not so much be a cheat sheet. And this is actually one of the reasons why I very deliberately do not go into detail on sources. I don't give references for the most part because I don't want to be doing people's research for them. I will always suggest where people might want to go and read if they ask me. But what I wanted was just to spark ideas and information and get people thinking about that stuff in a way that I had the privilege of being exposed to, I suppose. And you say it's that balance between that sort of being a bit creative and having fun with it, but also being serious, being taken seriously. It hasn't been straightforward. I still haven't cracked in that sense. Offering commissioned film work to colleagues, to universities, to others, I still have to do an awful lot of explaining just to get my foot in the door on that stuff. And I think that's partly an academic cultural thing. It's also partly maybe I haven't worked hard enough on that aspect of marketing or something. But I think also as well, there's still a slight sense of reticence to potentially run the risk of devaluing, I guess, that knowledge base or that process of having gone and learned a whole lot of new stuff. Perhaps some people feel that it needs to be treated with particular care and in a particular way so as to be respected, as opposed to be simply accessible or merely accessible. And to be fair, not to rub it on, but to be fair, I do understand one aspect of that very keenly, and that is that I've never charged for this stuff. It's always been free to view on YouTube. It's always been accessible, and that's always been a central genuinely ethical stance that I've taken. But that also means that sometimes when I'm in a month where maybe I've gone, can I afford to buy this sandwich when I've been out and about in town, and someone's message saying, I've just been watching your video in California. I'm just like, bungers £5 then, bungers 50p and help me out. So it's not been easy. It's not been straightforward, but it's something that I am just naturally called. I feel called in that sense to do. I feel compelled. Compelled is a better word. Compelled to do. And I'll give you one final little example here. I can see that you're itching to ask another question. And that is that, so we're coming up on the Morpeth Northumbrian Gathering. It happens every year, and I've been going to it every year for years now, and having a history stall. And this year, as you know, I've had the idea of presenting history, genuine historical perspective on the theme of the festival, which is going to be fairies and the Fae, but from the standpoint that basically Disney does need tell the truth. Disney has commodified and cartoonified what should be something that you're aware of, and that the old stories of fairies, particularly from Wales and also in and around Northumberland as well, are crammed with warnings about the fairies. And so we're going to be turning up. Me and my friend have this plan to basically be doing almost like a Ghostbusters type thing, almost as though we're there and we don't know there's a festival on. We've just set up a stall where we're warning the public about fairies, bringing into it historical stories and little tidbits from Tudor medicine and other beliefs and this kind of thing. But presenting it in a way that hopefully will be a lot of fun. I'm going to be getting people to run around trying to catch fairies with nets and this kind of thing, So I just can't resist it. I think I'd get bored otherwise.
Don't you know every time somebody denies a fairy exists, a fairy dies?
I'm
I
not
mean,
saying they
isn't
don't.
it?
I'm not saying they don't exist, mate. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm saying you shouldn't be welcoming them into your house.
Look, to wrap up this section, I've got sort of one other maybe short question. But I mean, I know from your particularly the early part of your career, you did public-facing interpretive work for other people, particularly at the Jorvik Viking Centre.
Yeah.
Do you think that kind of public-facing, talking human to ordinary people who aren't specialists should be part of every archaeologist training?
I wouldn't want to force people to do it. I know archaeologists. I have friends and colleagues who would be terrified at the prospect of doing it because they for example, I sometimes joke that seed counters, people who look at samples in laboratories all day, but those sorts of archaeologists, it's not really necessary for them to do that per se. I mean, sometimes they might rock up on a radio interview or something, or be quoted in the news for some reason. But I wouldn't force those people to do that. But I would recommend it. I would say it's a great experience. It's a good way of getting out of your shell. For my part, both professionally and eventually personally, it gave me a grounding to establish a perspective on archaeology. And the world, in fact, just by being exposed to, for example, you're a bit hungover because it's York and you're young, and and that morning you're dressed as a Viking, and some Aussie comes up and is wondering why you're not open yet because they've travelled all halfway across the globe just to see you, and you've got to meet them where they're at. And more often than not, if you engage with that properly, it's fun. And it's engaging, and as you say, it is talking human. But one of the great things about working at Jorvik as well, I'm not saying that anyone currently working there necessarily does this. Don't want to get anyone in trouble, but certainly, for my part and for my generation of Vikings who work there, you could roll how you were feeling into your character. So if you were, a bit unwell, following the night before. You could roll that into being a slightly grumpy Viking, and people would love it. And I think so long as you are, it's about intent. So much of what archaeologists do, and so much of what I criticise archaeologists for not doing, is about intent. And in that sense, my intent was always to entertain, keep people safe, because that was a key aspect of being at Jorvik. Was don't fall down the stairs, don't get trapped on the ride, don't mangle someone, this kind of thing, with a sword when you're handing it to them. But also as well, hopefully, in addition to entertaining them, inform them. And hopefully people go away learning just something new, something a bit different, and being a bit challenged about ideas that they might not have had before they came in. And that doesn't mean you have to go out of that building as an expert on the Vikings, or even on Coppergate, the street in York where the experience is and the excavation that it was based on occurred. But you should come out knowing something you didn't know before, and maybe wondering how that connects to other parts of your life, perhaps. Hopefully.
Now, putting all that together, 14 years ago, you decide to create this entity called Archaeosoup. Now, again, as archaeologists, we're usually trained to write. You mentioned having written a dissertation when you were at Durham. We're trained to write reports, but the language
you haven't asked me about my dissertation, by the way. I'm very proud of it. No, do not. It's very boring. It's very boring.
Marc Barkman-Astles, tell us about your dissertation.
No, it's very boring. Go on. What were you going to say?
What I was going to say was, as archaeologists, we're trained to use words and very specific sort of scientific pictures.
Yeah.
In terms of it's very well framed. You don't use color filters. You don't use effects. You don't edit whatever. And you make sure you include all the scales and so on. So it's
a sort of third person detached approach.
Precisely that. We're not supposed to put any personality into what we write. Now, you've gone in the opposite direction in terms of the archaeology that you interpret, but I suspect you probably say that you offer the same sort of rigor, and you certainly support that kind of rigor. So what made you go down the, basically, it's a, although there's a website and you do other things, but your primary window on the world is a YouTube channel and latterly TikTok. So what made you go down that picture-led route?
I suppose first of all, it's easy to access. It's free to access, actually. Whenever I've been asked to, for example, speaking of my dissertation, I was asked whether or not I wanted to turn that into a book, and I was like, oh, interesting, because it was put in a list of important work done by undergrads at the university in the past 10 years. I was like, thank you very much. And someone got in touch on the back of that and said, yeah, would you like to turn this into a book? And I was like, oh, go on then, why not? And they're like, okay, great. It'll cost about £300. Of course, you'll have to pay us £300 to do that. And so that there's a barrier to entry there. Remember, at that point, I was looking for a job at a time when the market was flooded with people who didn't have jobs and so on and so forth. So YouTube, all you needed was an email, and I started off with an iPhone, an old iPhone, leaning it on a empty printer box sitting on the floor in our spare room in front of a bookshelf. So the barrier to entry was low, but also as well, it played with a little bit like with the fairies thing. In that sense, the fairies thing is drawing on things that I already do and I already kind of am a bit wary of how people are a bit too comfortable with fairies. In a very superstitious, silly way. I don't necessarily think fairies are actually going to do something to you, but I it prickles the good Welsh boys back, as it were. In that sense, working in video was drawing on other passions that I'd always had. I've actually just finished, in fact, recataloguing our joint DVD collection in this household, and we have more than 1,000 titles in the home. I worked at Blockbuster Video to earn a bit of money before I went to university, and all of that. I remember the Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, in an interview once said that his mum was like, "Stop watching TV. This is a waste of time." And he said, "No, this isn't a waste of time." He told himself, apparently, this is research, especially those early seasons of The Simpsons clearly were drawing on Leave It to Beaver and so many wholesome Americana tropes that he'd just absorbed through the TV screen and was criticizing and putting a different perspective on through his work. And for me, being especially at Blockbuster, where you at that time you would get 7 free rentals a week if you worked there, I was constantly watching films, constantly looking at the DVD extras and stuff, and just understanding how scenes were created, how stories were told, and it just felt very natural, given that YouTube was accessible, to use some of those ideas in that way. So, for example, in the first series I did on YouTube, the first thing I did was the A to Z of archaeology, and if you go back and look at, I can't quite remember which one it was actually, but there was an episode where my teddy, called Brownie, had kidnapped a Bronze Age looped palistave axe head and was threatening to drop it into a bowl of acid using an elaborate contraption, I think string and a candle. And I busted in and rescued it. And oh, that's right, it was about rescue archaeology. That's it. To show an archaeological point, and lots of different shots and angles, and it was all very, again, it's old footage. It's not great stuff to look at now, but I was clearly thinking in a storyboarded way about how to introduce ideas to people, and also things like using a bookshelf to demonstrate stratigraphy, or later on I came back to that to talk about additive and negative archaeology. So things, robber trenches, as opposed to stuff just being added to the archaeological record using Lego and soil. And so while it hasn't always had massive budgets or scope and scale, I think I've always thought and presented my ideas in a way which is visually, which relies on the visuals. Visually, the visuals are crucial to the explanation, but also as well, I can't help but for the most part, put a little bit of humour into things as well, and that's always been the case. And I know that well, you see, it's interesting because I was just about to say, I know that some colleagues might not think that's serious archaeology, that's doing the job well. But again, the people who taught me in my university experience always had a sense of humour about what they were doing, because for the most part I was being taught that you do not know for sure almost anything. And so you've got to hold your ideas and your ego lightly. Now, I'm not saying all academics succeed at that, and there were a couple of people who came to the department while I was there who definitely didn't succeed at that. Actually, there's one or two people in particular who, thankfully, they have now. As far as I can tell, but certainly needed to just to take a step back and look at themselves in terms of their have an ego check. But I've always thought that's how best to do it, and also how best to talk to yourself as much as anyone else is to say, okay, well, I guess if not humour, using humour to always ask yourself, is there a possibility here that I'm wrong? And that's something that people just don't tend to do, I think, is ask, is there a possibility that I'm wrong? In politics, in family interactions, in driving down the street, and so that, I think that's probably why this mishmash of influences are so natural to me, and why I continue to enjoy it, even though at times I find it a bit stressful.
Just one last point on this particular aspect of archaeology communication. Do you think we live in an increasingly picture-driven cultural ecosystem, and at the moment there are arguments. For example, there was a case, I think, recently in the States of a deep fake video. In fact, a recent European election, a deep fake video created by AI that may actually have even influenced the result. Do you think archaeology risks being left behind in that kind of world?
I suppose this is where yours and my work with Watching Brief really becomes more and more important. Is that through that work and through that sort of daily questioning of what archaeologists are doing and how we're responding to the world, I would say that at the very least I've been given a perspective and an opinion on that. Yeah, and I think possibly. I suppose I continue to be hopeful that the general culture of archaeology will continue to move with the times, but there is something a touch. I don't really know what the word would be. You're tempted to say stuffy. You're tempted to say institutionalized. You're tempted to say conservative, small c conservative. But I suppose actually really what it boils down to is a lack of confidence, actually, in the value of what archaeology is and the value that people place upon archaeology. And so experimentation with presentation and being open to meeting people where they are, and indeed people who will never agree with you, is something which a lot of archaeologists seem to struggle with. And more to the point, what I should say, visible archaeologists. So archaeologists who most of us in the archaeological community will see as being leaders or leading the way in terms of the tone and the culture, we still seem to be answering questions with the same answers and using the same people and having the same opinions. And that's got to be, that's stale. That's got to be you run the risk of being very stale if you do that, I think. As for the AI stuff, I'm not entirely sure how that directly impacts day-to-day archaeology, but I think it's only going to make it make, in the context, for example, of the TV series Ancient Aliens. Can you imagine if generative AI was around then? And what sort of stuff could come out of the fever dreams of pseudo archaeology and people who were really trying to make a case for something for which they had no actual evidence back then. So I can imagine that there being almost a second wave, a revival of pseudo archaeological and sort of ancient aliens like ideas through the lens of AI, and we are sort of seeing that. For example, on platforms like TikTok, you do see people now creating an AI version of Joe Rogan on his podcast saying, "This is amazing. I can't believe that people didn't know this." And it cuts to this sort of whole spiel about, I don't know, Sumerians having wristwatches or something. So it is there. And I suppose my fear when it comes to that stuffiness, conservatism, and internalized lack of confidence, I should say. I'm a real scientist, mum and dad, honestly, that kind of thing, is that actually you're going to end up with a reaction to to that sort of content, as opposed to being proactive about it. So what I mean to say is, when a film comes out, or when a TikTok comes out, or when something else comes out that you don't like, all you do is scream at it and shout about it and write an anonymous open letter and get people to sign it and to make yourself feel better, rather than doing something proactive, creative, engaging, and fun. Because ultimately, the stuff the reason why this stuff is a threat is because it's more engaging, and it's similar. I mean, I'm sure you're aware it's similar problems to what archaeologists have been facing since the 70s and 80s. Glossy publications by people like von Daniken, people like Hancock, and others. Coffee table, beautiful photos with wild speculation has always been there in that sense. Certainly as far as my professional life is concerned. And I still don't think we have an answer to it. I still, archaeologists in general have an actual answer to it, other than to say, well, actually, we know better. I think lots of people are working on that, though, and there is a good generation of archaeologists who are experimenting in that sphere, and hopefully, answers will come.
I suggest maybe that a lot of it comes down to trust, and to be trusted you have to be out there and creating an engaging persona that people want to engage with, and then to say, yeah, actually I trust what that person says because they present A, B, and C and tell it straight, and so on. Maybe archaeology is not so good at that.
Well, possibly, but also crucially, archaeology, the only conversations I've seen about this from people who actually are thinking, have been writing about particularly social media and archaeology, the closest I've seen in terms of these conversations has been talking about authority, not trust. How can we maintain a voice of authority in this realm or on social media? How can I possibly start a Facebook page when anyone can start a Facebook page? How will people know that I'm me and that I know what I'm talking about? Authority and trust are not the same thing. Although trust can often lead to people being taken as an authority. And that way the vacuum gets filled with all sorts of interesting ideas.
I'll perhaps just we need to sort of move towards a conclusion, and I would say that obviously your back catalogue, Archaeosoup's back catalogue, is full of it's a thick, chunky broth, to take the soup analogy on, of archaeologists, of aspects of archaeology, of explanations of archaeological techniques. It's a one-stop primer, very easily approachable primer for people who are interested in archaeology in its widest extent, I suppose. From somebody who's who's seen a local dig in action to somebody who's watched one of the Indiana Jones movies. So taking that on board, you have actually also branched into some of the more esoteric areas of archaeology, one of which is gaming. And which again is another picture-driven. Once you got out of the ZX80 adventure, option A, option B, option C in the sort of computer novel game kind of thing that I think the very first incarnation of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on the web on the computer rather did. But and you've even been involved in things like archaeological explorations of the massive multiplayer online worlds and so on. How does that fit into your archaeological world?
Well, I mean, first,
or is it just fun?
First, I should say it's people like Andrew Reinhard and others who have really pushed that boundary of so-called Archaeo-Gaming. I naturally got into it because I couldn't help but have thoughts about the worlds that you experience in gaming. For example, the phenomenology of Whiterun in Skyrim was one of the earliest videos I put out on that topic, or in that sort of approach, and it really came because it was a good teaching tool. It was a good way of demonstrating a concept to be in this landscape and not have to go out on a rainy day to the Yorkshire moors or something and try and do something similar. But actually, I think really what for example, exploring the Hyrule map as laid out in Breath of the Wild, and soon I plan on going to the Tears of the Kingdom version of that map. It started to become, and Andrew certainly talks about this as well, to become an examination of things on various levels. So first of all, the game is an artifact. It is something which is created by culture and created by humans who have certain cultural influences. Some of them accurate historical ideas, some of them researched historical ideas, some of them entirely inaccurate and or creatively necessary for the game to exist. So you have this opportunity to understand what the people who made these worlds thought about, for example, archaeological ruins. So often if you turn up in a particular spot and look at the layout of ruins in a landscape, they will make no sense, but they will look cool. They'll be kind of like a folly in that sense that we see in real world landscape archaeology, something which an aristocrat put on the crest of a mountain so he could see it from his bedroom window, that is false, but nonetheless it says something about what people are looking for from that landscape. The second layer, which I find very compelling and actually very satisfying to this have been shown to have borne out between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom in those Zelda games, is that actually when you're reading the landscape as an archaeologist, and it's done in a way, and the landscape exists, whether they've done it deliberately or they've done it because that's just how the real world operates, exists with a story that unfolds because you've been trained to read the landscape in a certain way or to understand how things might have changed and evolved over time. You actually can understand more about what's happening in that world, and therefore actually you are doing archaeology just on a different plane. You can't quite do recording in the same way. You certainly can't publish in the same way or about the same things necessarily. But for example, in Breath of the Wild, I posited the existence of of a group of people connected where they lived to where they were burying their dead, and suggested other aspects which essentially were shown to be correct in the opening moments of the second of those two Zelda games. Now, to be fair, they were shown to be correct in the development of that game and also in the release of the making of art book. But what was interesting about that wasn't just vindicating for me and thought processes, but actually what it showed was how broadly applicable archaeological observations and ideas are in terms of understanding the world around you, and that's really compelling and really exciting, and I've seen that happen in the real world. For example, here in Wallsend, with going on an urban archaeology walk with a bunch of kids, high school kids who, let's face it, some of the lads are just there because they have to be there. They're kind of looking at their phones all the time. But by the end of the walk, they're actually really into it, and they're spotting things and they're pointing at things, and they're changing how they experience their walk to school every day. I literally had one kid who I thought couldn't be bothered being there saying to me at the end of one of the walks, "I'm never going to walk to school the same way again." And it's the way that the computer games offer that opportunity to show people what you're seeing and how you see the world, that I find really compelling. But one thing I would say, just for the sake of a broader explanation, and I'm sure Andrew would appreciate me saying as well, is that there is genuinely a frontier, possibly, in digital worlds of particularly in procedurally generated worlds, so worlds where you have a set of rules, or a universe where there's a set of rules, and the game itself just generates a world with certain type of atmosphere, certain type of gravity, certain types of animals turn up, certain types of architecture here and there, pottery even. There's an opportunity there to really test the limits of what we can tell about something from physical remains, because this stuff hasn't been invented directly by a human mind. And so if you want to have a test case for xenoarchaeology, archaeology of other civilizations on other planets even, or even just that old sort of Sherlock Holmes idea of going onto a place and finding out what is the truth of this, actually a computer game can be really good for that, because and I haven't kept up to date, I'll have to go back and check, but certainly Andrew's work in No Man's Sky was starting to push those sorts of boundaries and essentially feed back to archaeological theory how we can improve perhaps some of the assumptions that we make about 3D space and so on and so forth by doing it in a computer game. So on the face of it, as you say, it sounds like something which could be just not serious. It could just be like, oh, look, there's a castle, and then just hopping through and doing a sort of a truffle finding exercise of stuff that reminds you of real world history and archaeology. But actually, there's a lot there, from the game as an artifact all the way through to fully testing archaeological theory in a really strict intellectual sense. And so it's kind of interesting. I don't do that, to be fair, to be clear. I stream on Twitch and I have a lot of fun with it. But I appreciate that that's possible at that end of things. Yeah.
Now, as I said at the beginning, there are two traditional questions at the end of a Meet the Archaeologist. Mm-hmm. One of which is, I think, intimately tied up with another aspect of your work with ArchaeoSoup, and it's certainly the one I'm most familiar with, and at least I've had the most involvement with, which is the watching brief, where, I mean, way back, I think almost from the get-go, you ran archaeology news under the brand ArchaeoScoop.
Yes.
And then a while back, we, between us, sort of grew the format, and it became the watching brief, which was much more news and current affairs and investigatory, which implies that you think there are things that can be done better in the world of archaeology, or things that need to be explained better, or things where actually sometimes as a profession we're just going wrong, and you're not afraid to say so. And so wrapping that up with that traditional question from Meet the Archaeologist, what challenges do you see for archaeology in the future, as a discipline, as the way it is, as the way it's communicated, as the way it's run, as the way it interacts with the public and with government?
I'm how serious do you want me to be? I mean, in that sense, in a word, authoritarianism. This is something that you and I have talked about in the past and off camera, and it's a question that I keep on coming back to, and it's one that sounds extremely serious. It's one that almost sounds alarmist, actually, on the face of it. And the question that I asked you one day was, in one of our editorial meetings, was, does archaeology have a growing authoritarian problem? And I mean that directly in contrast to the type of archaeology that I cherish, that I was taught to do, and that I was encouraged to do, in terms of open conversation, intellectual curiosity, to the point of breaking something, but not to break something. You sort of want to understand it in that sense, and an approach to archaeology which is fundamentally collaborative, that's seeking to answer a question with other people's help, with as much good ideas and evidence and help as possible, so as to together create an idea of the past which is improving and which has an ever better resolution and which can be interrogated even more by people who come to your work later. I think there's an issue in potentially in UK archaeology, I should say, of personality overtaking best practice in some cases, and I don't want to necessarily. I shouldn't be too specific, not least because we are still working on stuff on Watching Brief, which I hope will comment on this further. But I feel as though some people either do or want to hold so much sway over how archaeology is done and how archaeologists think and what real archaeologists are, that we run the risk of really choking off the profession in terms of its variety, its adaptability, and also a true, genuine attempt to have conversations and to allow people into those conversations from as many backgrounds, sexualities, psychologies, economic backgrounds, genders, sexes, ages, nationalities as possible. And I don't know. Do you want to ask me a follow up? In so much as I'm not sure if I'm sounding alarmist, because I'm not wanting to pick on any individual case study, but there are several out there if people want to look for them.
Well, what I will do is I'll wrap it up into the sort of final question, which is traditionally, what advice have you got to somebody who wants to get into archaeology? But I'll wrap that up with another comment, and again, it's some of the latest output on the Archaeo-Soup channel. But for the 14th anniversary, you've done a group of, I think, 3, video essays. One of which is called "Do I Still Want to Be an Archaeologist?" And so I'll ask you, Marc Barkman-Astles, do you still want to be an archaeologist? And if you do, what would you say to somebody who's thinking of following me and creating an Archaeo-Soup of the future?
Yeah, it's a question I've been asking myself. That was technically the fourth. That was coming out off the back of 3 videos, which I had called archaeological fallacies. That was the fourth one that was an inevitable question given what I've been saying in the previous 3 videos. And in short, yes, I do still want to be an archaeologist. I am an archaeologist. I don't think you can just turn it off. One of the things that I find actually simultaneously satisfying, but also actually sometimes quite alarming, is how difficult it is, especially in terms of time depth, to just stop thinking like that and stop thinking about the world as having a long history, and as having, and as our society as having precedents and previous iterations and other possibilities and so on. So it's, I don't think I could stop if I wanted, but I have been, I've taken some battle scars. I have some bruises. I've been battered here and there by that interaction of some of that openness and curiosity and I wouldn't say idealism, but maybe naivety, possibly, in terms of how I hoped archaeology might work, and it being tested, hitting the real world, and actually starting up Archaeosoup in some ways was one of those big tests, hitting the real world, because suddenly I became aware that there are people out there who might think of you as a rival, or who might think of you as a business threat, or as someone who is trying to undermine their research activities or their influence, and that was hard. That was really hard, and I don't know, about 10 years ago, I almost stopped Archaeosoup, actually. I didn't necessarily make it overly clear at the time. But for those reasons, yeah, it definitely was an issue. And sometimes it still is an issue. Sometimes I have difficult days. But just to sort of flesh out that, do you want to be an archaeologist? I am now very deliberately being more than an archaeologist. I very deliberately now do artwork and go to art fairs and sell stuff, and funnily enough, I've come full circle. I started out as a high school student who thought he was going to be an artist, and now, ironically enough, art is now the thing that I can do, and it doesn't feel like such a personal and emotional strain as sometimes being an archaeologist is. Like it's so strange in that sense, and maybe it's because at the time I was a teenager and I had all sorts of things, psychological things that I had to wrestle with I didn't even know about. Whereas now I'm much more older and wiser, and I can do art in a way which is, which isn't quite so emotionally intense, I guess. Whereas archaeology is still quite intense at times, and it's because I love it. It's because, and I think the same goes for you, Andy. It's because we love it. We love archaeology at its best. We hope it has a future, and sometimes it can be a bit frustrating to see people doing things that either are short-sighted, possibly, or actively retrograde, actively not doing what it says on the tin. Archaeology, on the face of it, is a wonderful thing. It studies whole worlds. We recreate landscapes, psychologies, philosophies, religions, food, family structures, vehicles, artifacts. It's a wonderful thing. But sometimes the habits that we get into in terms of how it's done can lead to a sort of conformity. And I know I hinted at this when I talked about authoritarianism. But that's the reason why I asked, do I still want to be an archaeologist? And I do. In terms of advice to people, young people, old people, anyone who's interested in getting into archaeology, I suppose primarily younger people at this point, but because some of my thoughts really are probably more pertinent to someone who hasn't got a pension, for example. I don't have a pension, and that's the thing. That's the thing. My advice would be, think about it very carefully. You can always do archaeology, at the moment anyway, later. That's something I never thought I'd say. I never thought I'd say that. And throughout most of Archaeosoup, I've said, yes, do it. Get into archaeology. You'll figure it out. It'll be fine. Some of the challenges to do with data management and I don't know, pay structure, paying conditions, they'll figure. That'll sort itself out. I now am not fully confident that things will fundamentally change, and that's down to leadership. I desperately want to see good things from, for example, the Council for British Archaeology in its 80th year this year. It'd be wonderful to hear movement on things that would make it easier for me to say, yes, definitely get into archaeology, do it. I suppose a more subtle way of saying that would be to say, see if you love it. See what you love about archaeology. Follow what you love. Follow what interests you. Ask questions. Reach out to people, because for the most part, archaeologists of all stripes do like talking about what they do, as far as I can tell, anyway. And see where it takes you. But be ready to make the case for archaeology as a necessary part of the academic and socio-economic and public well-being landscape, and the environmental landscape, and maybe be ready to hold people to account, a little bit earlier than perhaps I did. In my early 20s, I wasn't really thinking about it like this, but I wish in some ways that I had examined what certain institutions say they do and asked why weren't they actually delivering on that stuff. Because 14 years later, archaeologists are still talking about paying conditions, still worried about whether or not people take archaeology seriously, and still relying on the same answers to those questions. Things like civil engineering projects, things like short, burning hot and bright in the media landscape in terms of having a campaign here or there, or coming up with a hashtag or a slogan, as opposed to sustained effort to make archaeology what we all feel it kind of already is. And that's not a career in ruins, incidentally. I don't think it is a career in ruins. I think it genuinely can add to your life. It can make you a better person. It can make you more considerate. It can also add to society, I think. And we just need to have that expectation from people who are, at the moment, in charge. And I don't know. Maybe I'm rambling at this point, but yes, if you want to do it, look into it.
And one very final question. Perspective's always important, I think, in pretty much any aspect of life. What does Marc Barkman-Astles do when he's not being an archaeologist? What does he do to escape, to unwind?
Computer games, music, hanging out with Mrs. Soup, and at the moment, a lot of paintings. I'm very much enjoying taking old, abandoned paintings from charity shops and putting new things into those landscapes. And some of that actually is influenced by archaeology. Some of it I can't help but bring in, like a statue from Lipensky Viel and put it on a beach somewhere, this kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I tend to do. I try to relax, but I'm not very good at it.
I think that's a very good point to end our conversation on. Marc Barkman-Astles, thank you very much for letting us meet the archaeologist 14 years into Archaeo Soup.
Thank you very much. Cheers. This has been weird, but thank you.
Well, that was a very special edition of Archaeo Soup's Meet the Archaeologist for the 14th anniversary of the Archaeo Soup channel. Obviously, you can continue to follow Archaeo Soup on YouTube, on TikTok, and if you want to support the work that Marc does on Archaeo Soup, you can follow on Patreon from as little as $1 a month, and there are various goodies on offer as well if you go and look at the Patreon page. If you enjoy the work that we do on the Watching Brief, there's a separate Patreon tier for Watching Brief, and I also ask you, if you like what we do, to buy me a Ko-fi or a beer or whatever from time to time. But whatever you do, enjoy the videos, share them with your friends and colleagues, and we'll see you next time.